When we talk about the last goodbye, what we are really speaking about is the moment the narcissist can no longer keep up the belief that they are in charge. For years, maybe even decades, the whole relationship has circled around one particular pattern of behavior. Power. Not always power in the obvious way like controlling your every move or decision, though that often happens too. It goes much deeper than that. It is psychological control. It is the belief that they are the main figure, that your emotions and thoughts exist mostly because of them. The narcissist relies on this setup. It is where they get their emotional energy. When you make a real final goodbye, when you break the cycle of confusion and fully pull away, that whole structure starts to fall apart. You have to understand something about people who operate this way. Their identity is not built on a solid base. A healthy person, even when facing rejection or being left behind, usually has an inner framework to lean on. They have personal values, meaningful goals, or real relationships that help support them during hard times. The narcissist does not have this internal stability. Their identity is put together like a house of mirrors, constantly reflecting the admiration, attention, and validation of other people. Take away those reflections and the whole structure begins to crash down. The final goodbye is not just painful for them, it threatens the very identity they have built. It feels like a kind of death because the version of themselves they have carefully shown to the world cannot survive without someone else recognizing and validating it. This is why losing control is so terrifying for them. Power is not just a strategy, it is their emotional lifeline. The relationship itself was never truly about love or genuine care. Instead, it was always about pulling you into their reality. That attachment lets them feel significant, important, and real. But when that attachment breaks, when you step away and refuse to be pulled back into the cycle, they are left alone with themselves. That is exactly what they cannot stand. They cannot bear facing themselves. They cannot sit quietly with the emptiness that remains once the game is over. And here is something that might surprise you. Not every goodbye creates this kind of emotional collapse. Many people leave physically but stay emotionally connected. They keep arguing, responding, defending themselves, or reacting to every message. The narcissist keeps getting emotional fuel from that because even anger keeps the connection alive. A real goodbye is different. It removes even that last emotional thread. The silence, the distance, and the refusal to be drawn back into conflict become the biggest challenge to their illusion of power. That absence delivers the deepest blow to the control they believed they had. You can almost compare it to a hunter who suddenly finds that its target has completely vanished. The hunter does not just shrug and continue as if nothing happened. It becomes restless, desperate, and increasingly frantic because its survival depends on the chase. In much the same way, the narcissist's sense of identity depends on your continued participation in their emotional drama. Once that drama ends, they are left completely exposed. It is not only that they have lost you, they have also lost the emotional framework that convinced them they were powerful, significant, and in command. This emotional collapse often shows up through dramatic displays of emotion, explosive rage, complete denial, a desire for revenge, or even desperate pleading that seems completely out of character. But if you look at these reactions carefully, you will notice the same underlying desperation in every single one of them. They cannot accept losing control because they are not simply grieving the end of a relationship, they are experiencing the collapse of the identity they spent years building. The final goodbye exposes a truth they have spent their whole lives trying to avoid. It destroys the illusion that they were ever truly in control. And this is where it gets really interesting. The very thing they fight the hardest to keep, power, is exactly what disappears the moment you genuinely walk away. Their frantic attempts to regain control reveal something unexpected. They do not show strength, they reveal weakness hidden beneath a mask of dominance. The final goodbye exposes that reality more clearly than anything else. When the game finally ends, when every move has been played and your goodbye is real, the narcissist does not feel ordinary sadness or disappointment. They feel something much deeper. It is as though the carefully built world in which they sat at the center has started falling apart. That is why they resist it with such force and why they fight so desperately to stop it from happening. The truth is that losing control is not only their greatest fear, it eventually becomes unavoidable. No false identity, no matter how carefully maintained, can last forever. When it finally falls and you choose to walk away for good, one truth becomes impossible to hide. Their power was never real. The loss of control is not simply the end of a relationship. It marks the collapse of the illusion they created. In that moment, you become free while they are forced to face the one opponent they have spent their lives avoiding, themselves. When you reach the point of saying a true final goodbye to a narcissist, one of the first things you often notice is not only the loss of their control, but also the intense eruption of rage that follows. Stay with me here because this next part changes how you see everything. It is important to recognize that narcissistic rage is very different from ordinary anger. Healthy anger usually shows up when someone feels hurt, disappointed, or treated unfairly. It can often be expressed, understood, resolved, and eventually let go. Narcissistic rage is something completely different. It is sudden, overwhelming, and deeply rooted. It comes from a place far below the surface. It is the reaction of someone whose fragile sense of identity has been threatened at its very core. What makes this rage so overwhelming is that the narcissist sees your goodbye as something much bigger than rejection. To them, it feels like betrayal. Betrayal is not just painful from their viewpoint, it is almost unbearable. It destroys the belief that they are exceptional, superior, and somehow untouchable. They convince themselves they were essential to your life, that they were the center around which your world turned. The moment you walk away, you prove that belief was never true. Rather than accepting that reality, they respond with anger. This reaction becomes predictable because the narcissist never learned healthy emotional regulation. During childhood, many narcissists found ways to protect themselves from overwhelming feelings of shame, abandonment, or worthlessness by creating a false identity, an exaggerated image of confidence, superiority, and importance. That false identity became their emotional shield. When your final goodbye breaks through that shield, the unresolved wounds they spent years hiding suddenly rise to the surface. Rage becomes their defense mechanism. It lets them avoid facing the painful reality that they are no longer in control, and that the grand image they carefully maintained was built on illusion. That rage can show up in many different forms. Sometimes it arrives as explosive yelling, insults, accusations, or threats. Other times it becomes calculated and quiet through silent treatment, character attacks, gossip, or attempts to turn friends and family against you. In some situations, it disguises itself as victimhood, where they insist they are the one who has been deeply wronged in order to attract sympathy while hiding their anger. Although these reactions look different, they all come from exactly the same source. They cannot tolerate the fact that you are no longer willing to support the story they created about themselves. One of the most striking things about narcissistic rage is how completely out of proportion it often appears. Someone watching from the outside might wonder why a breakup or a final goodbye could possibly trigger such extreme behavior. But that observer is not witnessing an ordinary breakup. They are witnessing the collapse of an artificial identity that depended on constant validation. That is why it feels like the end of everything to the narcissist. Your departure does not simply represent one person leaving another. In their mind, it represents the destruction of the entire world they believed they controlled. If you have ever experienced this firsthand, you understand how deeply confusing it can become. The intensity of their anger can cause you to question your own judgment. You may start wondering whether you truly are the selfish or uncaring person they accuse you of being. That confusion is part of the trap. Their anger is not just emotional. It often serves a purpose. It is designed to pull you back into the familiar cycle where you react, defend yourself, and once again give them the emotional engagement they crave. That is why standing firm in the face of narcissistic rage is both incredibly difficult and absolutely necessary. Their anger is not really about who you are. It is about what your absence forces them to face. Your independence exposes the emptiness they have worked so hard to hide. Rather than facing that emptiness themselves, they try to project it onto you through blame, criticism, and emotional attacks, because doing so feels easier than confronting their own internal void. When you begin recognizing this pattern for what it truly is, not as a reflection of your value, but as evidence of their internal struggle, you slowly step outside the game they have spent years trying to keep you inside. And this is the part most people miss entirely. In many ways, narcissistic rage becomes an unexpected confession. It exposes the very vulnerability they have devoted their lives to concealing. Beneath all the confidence, arrogance, and superiority lies an overwhelming fear. They fear becoming insignificant. They fear abandonment. They fear facing themselves without another person constantly reflecting the grand image they desperately want to believe. Their rage is the moment the mask begins slipping. Their deepest insecurity becomes visible precisely when they are trying the hardest to appear powerful. That is why the final goodbye changes everything. When you remain firm despite their anger, when you refuse to be drawn back into the old cycle, you are doing much more than ending a relationship. You are confronting the fear they have spent their entire lives trying to escape. By remaining independent, you reclaim something they never wanted you to fully discover: your freedom, your emotional strength, and your ability to move forward without becoming trapped in their emotional world. Always remember this: their rage is not evidence of genuine power. It is evidence of profound desperation. Once you truly understand that difference, their attempts to manipulate you lose much of their influence. Narcissistic rage is the sound of a carefully constructed illusion beginning to collapse. When you choose not to respond, not to argue, and not to re-enter the cycle, you show once and for all that whatever control they once believed they had over you has finally come to an end. Now here is where things take a turn you might not expect. When the final goodbye has been spoken and the rage has either erupted or gradually cooled, narcissists often shift into a very different stage of behavior. It is a calculated attempt to regain control. It does not always appear obvious, and it does not always show itself as open hostility. Sometimes it is subtle, sometimes manipulative, and sometimes wrapped in emotional language that feels sincere on the surface. But underneath, the purpose stays the same: to pull you back into their orbit. What you need to understand is that narcissists do not view relationships as balanced exchanges of love, respect, or mutual understanding. Instead, they see them as power arrangements, a kind of emotional hierarchy where their sense of importance is continuously fed by your attention, emotional energy, and compliance. When you leave, you cut off that supply, and that creates what is often described as a narcissistic injury. That injury is deeply destabilizing for them, and their mind immediately begins searching for ways to repair it. This is why many people who finally walk away are surprised when the narcissist does not simply disappear. Instead, they often reappear with new tactics designed to re-establish contact. One of the most common strategies is known as hoovering, a term borrowed from a vacuum cleaner. The goal is simple: draw you back in by any means necessary. Sometimes hoovering appears as sudden kindness, where the narcissist comes back as the charming, caring version of themselves you once believed in. Other times it shows up as guilt-tripping, where they remind you of shared memories, emotional bonds, or past sacrifices, trying to trigger your empathy. They may present themselves as broken, lost, or in need of rescue. And when none of that works, the approach may shift again into pressure tactics, threats, emotional intimidation, or even attempts to paint you as cold or cruel. Despite the different forms, the intention is always the same: regain access to you. At the core of all this is one belief in their mind: that power must be restored, and you are the one who holds the key to it. What is revealing in these moments is how fragile their supposed strength actually is. If their power were real and stable, there would be no need for manipulation or emotional tactics. Genuine strength does not rely on persuasion, guilt, or deception to maintain itself. What you are seeing instead is dependence disguised as dominance. It becomes clear that they rely on you far more than you ever relied on them. And that realization is exactly what unsettles them the most. From a psychological standpoint, this behavior exposes the emptiness at the center of their identity structure. When they try to pull you back, it is not because they have suddenly gained insight or developed emotional depth. It is because your absence reflects something they cannot tolerate, the collapse of the image they built around themselves. Bringing you back, even temporarily, lets them obscure that reflection and avoid facing it directly. At this stage, the emotionally aware or compassionate person needs to be especially careful. Empathy is a powerful trait, but without boundaries, it becomes vulnerability. When a narcissist returns showing sadness, regret, or softness, it can easily trigger the natural instinct to help, to understand, or to forgive. But wisdom has to accompany empathy. Without wisdom, compassion becomes a doorway back into the same cycle you worked so hard to leave behind. The key question must always be, is this genuine transformation, or is this a reenactment designed to regain control? In most cases, when watched closely over time, it becomes clear that it is the latter. Real change is slow, consistent, and uncomfortable. It requires accountability, reflection, and a willingness to confront personal flaws. These are precisely the things narcissistic patterns avoid. What is often being seen instead is not transformation, but desperation, a reaction aimed at covering the emotional wound created by your departure. There is another important layer to understand here. When the narcissist tries to pull you back in, they are not simply trying to restore a relationship, they are trying to rewrite the ending. Pay close attention to this because it reveals everything about how they operate. A final goodbye represents closure, and closure is powerful. It signals completion. It says the story is finished and no further influence is allowed. For the narcissist, this is deeply threatening because closure removes their ability to keep the dynamic alive. If they can re-engage you even briefly, they regain the ability to blur that ending. They can reframe the narrative, suggesting that the separation was not final, that control is still shared, and that the story is still open. This is why one of the strongest responses in these situations is silence. Not explanation, not negotiation, not re-entry into discussion, but firmness and distance. Every response becomes material they can reinterpret. Every emotional reaction becomes fuel for the old cycle. Silence, in contrast, removes that fuel entirely. It is not passivity. It is control through non-participation. In this sense, silence is not weakness at all. It is one of the clearest expressions of internal strength. So, when the attempts to pull you back begin, it is important to recognize what is actually happening beneath the surface. It is not about love, reconciliation, or understanding. It is about avoidance. Avoidance of accountability, avoidance of emptiness, and avoidance of self-confrontation. If you re-enter the cycle, you restore their escape route. If you remain firm, you leave them without one. And what happens next is something almost no one sees coming. Eventually, when charm fails, when guilt no longer works, and when pressure tactics stop producing results, another phase often begins, the smear campaign. At this point, the focus shifts away from direct contact and toward reputation control. The goal is no longer to win you back personally, but to reshape how others see the situation. This happens because narcissists cannot tolerate the identity of being the one who was left. To them, abandonment is not just emotional, it is humiliating, and shame is something they struggle to process internally. Instead of absorbing it, they redirect it outward. They begin building an alternate narrative in which they are the victim and you are the cause of the damage. You may be described as unstable, ungrateful, overly emotional, or even harmful. This is not done purely for revenge. It is also an attempt to stabilize their own self-image by projecting uncomfortable truths onto someone else. The smear campaign serves a dual purpose. It punishes you for leaving while simultaneously protecting the narcissist from having to face what your departure actually means. By controlling the story that others hear, they try to maintain the illusion that they were never truly dependent on you at all, that they were the ones in power all along. But the very existence of the smear campaign tells a different story. Someone who was genuinely at peace with a separation would not need to wage war on the other person's reputation. The truth is that every tactic the narcissist uses, from rage to hoovering to the smear campaign, traces back to the same root cause, an identity that cannot sustain itself without external validation. When you walk away and stay away, you do something they never believed possible. You prove that their control was an illusion all along, and in doing so, you expose the one thing they have spent their entire lives running from: the emptiness inside themselves. The final goodbye is not just an ending, it is a mirror held up to their true reflection, a reflection they never wanted to see. When the game ends and you refuse to play anymore, the narcissist is left with nothing but themselves, no audience, no supply, no one to reflect back the image they so desperately need to believe. That is the moment the illusion dies, and that is the moment you truly become free. The game only continues if you keep playing. The moment you stop, it is over, not just for you, but for them too. Because without you, there is no game, there is no stage, there is no performance, there is only the silence they cannot bear and the self they cannot face.